Imagine a man so extraordinarily strong, he could take on and defeat a lion with his bare hands, no weapons or tools needed. A man whose physical strength was so immense, he could snap ropes like they were threads of straw and carry entire city gates up a mountain. This man was Samson, one of the judges of Israel, chosen by God to liberate his people from the oppression of the Philistines, an enemy nation that dominated Israel at that time. Yet, behind his unmatched physical strength lay a hidden weakness, a vulnerability that almost led to his complete ruin. Today, we're diving deep into the story of Samson, exploring his journey, his triumphs, his failures, and ultimately, his redemption. Through his life, we'll uncover powerful lessons about the true nature of strength, the dangers of spiritual weakness, and the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest of times. Samson's story begins with a divine announcement. His parents, Manoah and his wife, were barren and couldn't have children. One day, an angel of the Lord appeared to Samson's mother and announced that she would conceive a son who would be a Nazirite from birth. A Nazirite was someone consecrated to God, committed to specific vows, like not cutting their hair, not consuming wine or fermented drinks, and avoiding contact with dead bodies. This boy was destined to begin the deliverance of Israel from Philistine rule. The name Samson means little son, or like the sun, perhaps symbolizing the hope of a new dawn for Israel. From a young age, Samson demonstrated an unusual physical strength, which clearly came from the Spirit of God. His first recorded feat was confronting a young lion that attacked him. Without any weapons, Samson tore the lion apart as if it were a young goat. This strength wasn't just physical, but also symbolic, representing the power of God working through him to protect and liberate his people. Another notable example of his strength occurred when he was betrayed by his Philistine wife, who revealed the secret to a riddle he had proposed during a feast. Furious, Samson killed 30 Philistines to pay a debt and then retreated to a cave. Later, when the Philistines tried to capture him, he used a donkey's jawbone to kill 1,000 men, demonstrating a strength that defied any human explanation. However, behind all this physical strength, Samson had a critical weakness, his emotional vulnerability and his inability to control his desires. He was attracted to women who didn't share his faith or commitment to God. His first wife was a Philistine, and later he became involved with Delilah, another Philistine woman who would become his downfall. Delilah was bribed by the Philistine leaders to discover the secret of Samson's strength. After much persistence and manipulation, Samson finally revealed that his strength came from his Nazirite vow, symbolized by his never-cut hair. While he slept, Delilah cut his hair, and the Spirit of God left him. Samson was captured, blinded, and humiliated by the Philistines, becoming a spectacle of mockery and oppression. Despite his fall, Samson's story doesn't end in defeat. While imprisoned and forced to work like an animal, his hair began to grow again, symbolizing a return to his consecration to God. In a final act of strength, Samson was brought to a Philistine temple where thousands of people gathered to mock him. He prayed to God, asking for strength one more time to avenge himself on his enemies. With a supernatural push, he brought down the pillars of the temple, causing its destruction and killing himself, along with thousands of Philistines. Thus, even in his death, Samson fulfilled his purpose of beginning the liberation of Israel. Samson's story is filled with profound lessons. First, it shows us that true strength doesn't come solely from physical abilities, but from an intimate and obedient relationship with God. Samson was blessed with supernatural strength, but his failure to maintain his spiritual consecration led to his downfall. Second, Samson's story warns us about the dangers of hidden weaknesses. We all have vulnerable spots, and if we don't recognize them and surrender them to God, they can lead to our ruin. For Samson, his weakness was his uncontrolled desires and his overconfidence in himself. Finally, Samson's story teaches us about the possibility of redemption. Even after catastrophic failures, God can restore and use those who repent and turn back to him. Samson, in his final moments, recognized his dependence on God and was used powerfully even in his death. Samson, one of the judges of Israel, was born with a divine purpose that was revealed even before his birth. His mother, who was barren, was visited by an angel of the Lord, who announced to her that she would conceive and give birth to a son. This son would be a chosen instrument of God to begin the deliverance of Israel from the hands of the Philistines, who were oppressing the people at that time. From the womb, Samson was set apart to be a Nazirite, a title that carried with it a special consecration to God. The Nazirite vow involved three main commitments: abstaining from wine and other fermented drinks, avoiding contact with corpses, and above all, never cutting his hair. This hair, which grew freely and untouched, was not only an outward sign of his dedication to God, but also a tangible symbol of his supernatural strength, which was granted to him by the Spirit of the Lord. Samson's strength was legendary and defied the laws of nature. He was capable of feats that seemed impossible for an ordinary man. On one occasion, he faced a lion with his bare hands and tore it apart as if it were a young goat. On another, he captured 300 foxes, tied torches to their tails, and released them into the fields of the Philistines, causing great destruction. When surrounded by his enemies, he used a donkey's jawbone to kill 1,000 men, demonstrating a strength that could only come from divine power. Even the ropes that bound him, made to restrain an ordinary man, he broke with ease, as if they were strands of straw burned by fire. However, despite his extraordinary physical strength, Samson had a weakness that was not in his muscles, but in his heart. He was a man of intense and impulsive passions, and his life was marked by choices that often contradicted his sacred calling. His downfall began with his attraction to women who did not share his faith or his commitment to God. The most famous of these was Delilah, a Philistine woman who, by seducing him, discovered the secret of his strength. After being deceived by her repeatedly, Samson finally revealed that his strength came from his hair, which had never been cut. While he slept, Delilah cut his braids, and the Spirit of the Lord departed from him. Without his strength, Samson was captured by the Philistines, who blinded him and imprisoned him, humiliating him publicly. Despite his fall, Samson's story does not end in total defeat. In his weakest and most humiliated moment, he cried out to God for one last opportunity. With his hair growing again and his faith restored, Samson regained his strength for the last time. In the temple of the Philistines, where he had been taken to be ridiculed, he knocked down the pillars that supported the building, causing its destruction and killing himself along with thousands of Philistines. Thus, even in his death, Samson fulfilled part of the purpose for which he had been called, to begin the liberation of Israel from its oppressors. The life of Samson is a powerful reminder that true strength does not come only from physical abilities or supernatural gifts, but from a heart aligned with the will of God. His story teaches us about the consequences of giving in to temptations and neglecting our calling, but also about the mercy and grace of God, who can restore even those who have fallen most deeply. More introspective tone. Samson was vulnerable when it came to women. He fell in love easily, and it was precisely this weakness that led him to trust Delilah, the woman who would betray him. How often in our lives do we also have weak spots that lead us to make wrong decisions? Samson shows us that however strong we may be, we all have areas that need to be protected and surrendered to God. Samson's story, although marked by failures and moments of weakness, does not end with his fall. After being betrayed by Delilah, having his braids cut, and losing the strength that came from his consecration to God, Samson was captured by the Philistines, his declared enemies. They imprisoned him, gouged out his eyes, and took him to Gaza, where he was publicly humiliated. forced to work as a slave, grinding a mill in prison. This was a scene of complete defeat and despair, where Samson, once a mighty hero, was now reduced to a shadow of what he once was. However, even in the midst of this physical and spiritual darkness, a spark of hope remained alive in his heart. As Samson suffered the consequences of his choices, his hair, the symbol of his Nazirite vow, began to grow again. This seemingly small detail was a sign that God had not yet abandoned his servant. Although Samson had failed to keep his commitment to God, the Lord, in his infinite mercy, still had a plan for him. The Philistines, proud of their victory over Samson, decided to hold a great celebration in honor of their god Dagon, to whom they attributed the capture of the mighty judge of Israel. They brought Samson to the temple, where thousands of people gathered to mock him and celebrate his defeat. It was in this moment of extreme humiliation that Samson, weak and blind, cried out to God in a final act of faith. He asked the Lord to remember him and give him strength once again, not to take personal revenge, but to fulfill the purpose for which he had been called from his mother's womb, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. In an act of divine power, God heard his prayer and restored his strength. Samson, leaning on the central pillars of the temple, pushed them with all his might, causing the building to collapse on everyone present. At that moment, Samson died along with the Philistines, but he fulfilled in his last act the purpose that God had established for his life. Samson's story is a powerful reminder that even when we fail dramatically and painfully, God can still restore our lives and use our circumstances to fulfill his purposes. Samson was not a perfect man. He made serious mistakes, allowed himself to be carried away by his passions, and neglected his calling. However, in his weakest moment, he turned to God with a sincere heart, and the Lord used him in a powerful way, even in his death. This shows us that God's grace is greater than our failures, and that he can transform even our greatest defeats into victories for his kingdom. The life of Samson teaches us that true strength is not in our physical ability or in our perfection, but in our dependence on God. He is the only one who can restore us, redeem us, and use us, regardless of our failures. His story is an invitation for us to, even when we fall, rise again, cry out to the Lord, and trust in his power to fulfill his purposes in our lives. And you? What are the areas of your life that are crying out for divine intervention? What are those situations, challenges, or weaknesses that seem insurmountable and that you carry like a heavy burden? The story of Samson, one of the judges of Israel, offers us a powerful lesson about the strength that comes from God, even when we feel fragile and incapable. Samson was a man gifted with extraordinary physical strength, but his real battle was not against the Philistines, but against his own weaknesses and misguided choices. He was strong, but also vulnerable, courageous, but prone to failure. However, even in his darkest moments, when his strength was taken away and he found himself humiliated and blind, God still used him in a powerful way to fulfill his purposes. This leads us to reflect. What are the weaknesses that you need to surrender to God today? Perhaps it is a struggle against pride, insecurity, anxiety, fear of the future, or even an addiction that seems uncontrollable. It could be a strained relationship, a disappointment that still hurts, or a decision that you made and now regret. The truth is that we all have areas in our lives that need divine strength, because no matter how hard we try, we cannot solve everything on our own. And it is precisely in these moments of weakness that God invites us to trust in him, to surrender our burdens, and to allow him to act in a supernatural way. Samson's journey teaches us that God does not give up on us, even when we fail. He specializes in transforming weaknesses into opportunities to manifest his glory. When we recognize our limitations and place them in his hands, we open space for him to do great things in our lives. After all, God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, as the Apostle Paul reminds us in 2 Corinthians 12:9. Therefore, today is the day to stop trying to carry everything alone. It is the moment to look inside yourself, identify what has been preventing you from moving forward, and with humility, surrender it to God. He can not only restore what is broken, but also transform your weaknesses into powerful testimonies. Samson's story challenges us to trust that even when we feel weak, God is working in us and through us. And you? Are you ready to surrender your weaknesses to Him and experience what only divine strength can do?